back to my channel. I'm back with Surprised by Joy by C.H. Lewis. I know I did the one chapter several weeks ago, but I was sick, and then I'm trying to get back organized with all my readings and stuff in my puzzles. But I'm gonna try to read chapter 2 today, and we'll see. I feel like this is not like your typical book. I know the next chapter is called Concentration Camp. The first chapter that I read was called The First Year. So I am going to try to read the whole chapter, which is going to be a little longer. But anyway, let's get to it. And I'm not using my microphone until I get caught up with what I wanted to do. Then I will use the microphone again. But in the meantime, right now, I'm just gonna do it with my phone, and so I can get these book back on track. See, I feel like this book, it's a little bit more serious. So, especially with this chapter 2, concentration camp, I feel like a little bit, heavy. So, arithmetic with colored rods times educational supplement, 19 of November, 1954. Clop, 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 clop. We are in a four-wheeler rattling over the uneven square sets of the Belfast streets through the damp twilight of September evening, 1908. My father, my brother, and I'm going to school for the first time. We are in low spirits, my brother, who has most reason to be so, for he alone knows what we are going to, shows his feelings least. He is already a veteran. I perhaps am buoyant up by a little excitement, but very little. The most important fact at the moment is the horrible clothes I have been made to put on. Only this morning, only 2 hours ago, I was running wild in shorts and blazer and sand shoes. Now I am choking and sweating, itching too. I think dark stuff, throttled by an eaten collar, my feet already aching with unaccustomed boots. I'm wearing snickerbockers that button at the knee every night for some 40 weeks of every year, and for many years. Yeah, I am to see the red smarting imprint of those buttons in my flesh when I undress. Worst of all is the bowler hat, apparently made of iron, which grasped my head. I have read the boys in the same predicament who welcome such things as signs of growing up. I had no such feeling. Nothing in my experience had ever suggested to me that it was nicer to be a schoolboy than a child, or nicer to be than a man than a schoolboy. My brother never talked much about school in the holidays. My father, whom I implicitly believed represented adult life, as one of the incessant drudgery under the continental thread of financial ruin. In this he did not mean to deceive us. Such was his temperament that when he exclaimed, as he frequently did, "There'll soon be nothing for it but the workhouse," he momentarily believed, or at least felt, that he said I took it literally, and had the gloomiest anticipation of adult life. In the meantime, the putting on the school clothes was, I well knew, the assumption of a prison uniform. We reach the quay and go on aboard the old Fleetwood boat. After some miserable strolling about the deck, my father bids us goodbye. He's deeply moved. I, alas, am mainly embarrassed and self-conscious. When he has gone ashore, we almost, by comparison, cheer up. My brother begins to show me over the ship and tell me about all other shipping in sight. He's an experienced traveler and a complete man of the world. A certain agreeable excitement steals over me. I like the reflected port and starboard lights on the oily water, the rattle of winches, the warm smell from the engine room skylight. We cast off. The black space within between us and the quay. I feel a throb of screws underneath me. Soon we are dropping down below, and there's a taste of salt on one's lips, and the cluster of lights astern receding from us is everything I have known. Later, when we have gone to our bunks, it begins to blow. It is a rough night, and my brother is seasick. I absurdly envy him this accomplishment. He is behaving as experienced travelers should. By great efforts, I succeed in vomiting, but it is a poor affair. I was and am an obstinately good sailor. No Englishman will be able to understand my first impression of England. When we disembarked, I supposed at about 6 next morning, but it seemed to be midnight. I found myself in the world to which I reacted with immediately hatred. The flats of Lancashire in the early morning are in reality a dismissal sight to me. They are like the blanks of sticks. The strange English accents with which I was surrounded seemed like a voice of demons. But what was worst was the English landscape from Fleetwood to Euston. Even to my adult eye, that main line still appears to run through the dullest and most unfriendly strip in the island. But to a child who had always lived near the sea and in sight of high ridges, it appeared, as I supposed Russia might appear to an English boy. The flatness, the interminableness, the miles and miles of featureless in shutting one of the in from the sea, imprisoning, suffocating. Everything was wrong. Wooden fences instead of stone walls and hedges, red bricks, farmhouses instead of white cottages, the fields too big, haystacks the wrong shape. Well, does the Kalevala say that in this stranger's house the floor is full of knots? I have made up a quarrel since, but at the moment I convinced a hatred for England which took many years to heal. Our destination was a little town of, let us call it Belson, in Hertfordshire. Green Hertfordshire, Lamb calls it. But it was not green to a boy bred in a county town. It was a flat Hertfordshire, flinty Hertfordshire of the yellow soil. There is the same difference between the climate of Ireland and England as between that of England and the continent. There was far more weather at Belson than I had ever met before. There first new bitter frost and stinging fog, weltering heat and thunderstorms on the great scale. There through the curtainless first came to know the ghastly beauty of the full moon. The school, as I first knew it, consisted of some 8 or 9 boarders and about as many day boys. Organized games, except for endless rounders in the flinty playground, had long been moribund and were finally abandoned not very long after my arrival. There was no bathing except once weekly bath in the bathroom. I was already doing Latin exercises as taught by my mother when I went there in 1908, and I was still doing Latin exercises when I left there in 1910. I had never got in sight of a Roman author. The only stimulating element in the teaching consisted of a few well-used canes which hung on the green iron chimney piece of the single schoolroom. The teaching staff consisted of the headmaster and proprietor. We called him Oldie, his grown-up son Wee Wee, and an usher. The ushers succeeded one another with great rapidity and lasted for less than a week. Another was dismissed in the presence of the boys with a rider from Oldie to the effect that is he were not in holy orders, he would kick him downstairs. This curious scene took place in a dormitory, though I cannot remember why. All these ushers, except the one who stayed less than a week, were obviously as much in awe of Oldie as we. But there came a time when there were no more ushers, and Oldie's youngest daughter taught the junior pupils. By that time, there were only 5 boarders, and Oldie finally gave up his school and sought a cure of souls. I was one of the last survivors and left the ship only when she went down under us. Oldie lived in a solitude of power, like a sea captain in the days of sail. No man or woman in the house spoke him as an equal. No one except Wee Wee initiated conversations with him at all. At meal times, we boys had a glimpse of his family life. His son sat on his right hand. They too had separate food. His wife and 3 grown-up daughters, silent. The usher, silent. The boys, silent, munched their inferior messes. His wife, though I think she never addressed Oldie, was allowed to make something of a reply to him. The girls, 3 tragic figures dressed summer and winter and in the same shabby black, never went beyond an almost whisper, "Yes, Papa," or "No, Papa." On the rare occasions when they were addressed, few visitors entered the house. Beer, which Oldie and Wee Wee drank regularly at dinner, as offered to the usher, but he was expected to refuse. The one who accepted got his pint, but was taught his place by being asked a few moments later in a voice of thunderous irony, "Perhaps you would like a little more beer, Mr. N." Mr. N, a man of spirit, replied casually, "Well, thank you, Mr. C. I think I would." He was the one who did not stay till the end of his first week, and the rest of the day was a black one for us boys. I myself was rather a pet or mascot of Oldie's, a position which I swear I never sought, of which an advantage were purely negative. Even my brother was not one of his favorite victims, for he had his favorite victims, boys who could do nothing right. I have known Oldie enter a schoolroom after breakfast, cast his eye around and remark, "Oh, there you are, Reese. You horrid boy. If I'm not too tired, I shall give you a good drubbing this afternoon." He was not angry, nor was he joking. He was a big, bearded man with full lips, like but I question whether his cruelty had an erotic element in it. I have divided then and seem to see clearly now what all his whipping boys had in common. They were the boys who fell below a certain social status, the boys with vulgar accents. Poor P, dear honest, had hard-working, friendly, healthily, pious, P was flogged insensibly. I now think for one offense only. He was a son of a dentist. I had seen Oldie make the child bend down at one end of the schoolroom and then take a run of the room's length at each stroke. But P was the train suffered in countless thrashings, and no sound escaped him until towards the end of the torture there came a noise quite unlike a human utterance, that peculiar croaking and rattling cry that the grey faces of all the other boys and their death-like stillness are among the memories I could willingly dispense with. The curious thing is that despite all this cruelty, we did surprisingly a little work. This may have been partly because the cruelty was irrational and unpredictable, but it was partly because of the curious methods employed. Except at geometry, which he really liked, it might be said that Oldie did not teach at all. He called his class up and asked questions. When the replies were unsatisfactory, he said in a low, calm voice, "Bring me my cane. I see, I shall need it." If a boy became confused, Oldie flogged the desk, shouting in a crescendo, "Think, think, think." Then, as a prelude to execution, he muttered, "Come out, come out, come out." When really angry, he proceeded to antics, worming for wax in his ear with his little finger and babbling, I have seen him leap up and dance around and around like a performing bear. Meanwhile, almost in whispers, wee, or the usher, or later, Oldie's youngest daughter, was questioning us juniors at another desk. Lessons of this sort did not take very long. What was to be with the boys for the rest of the time, Oldie had decided that they could, with least trouble to himself, be made to do arithmetic. Accordingly, when you entered school at 9 o'clock, you took your slate and began doing sums. Presently, you were called up to say a lesson. When that was finished, you went back to your place and did more sums, and so forever. All the other arts and sciences thus appeared as islands, mostly rocky and dangerous islands, which like to rich in various gems inlaid and adorned bosoms of the deep being a shoreless ocean of arithmetic. And at the end of the morning, you had to say how many sums you had done, and it was not quite safe to lie, but supervision was slack and very little assistance was given. My brother and I told you that he was already a man of the world, soon found the proper solution. He announced every morning with perfect truth that he had done 5 sums. He did not add that they were the same 5 every day. It would be interesting to know how many thousand times he did them. I must restrain myself. I could continue to describe Oldie for many pages, some of the worst unsaid, but perhaps it would be wicked, and it's certainly not obligatory to do so. One good thing I can tell of him, impelled by conscience, a boy who once confessed to stick to the truth. I can also say that, though, he taught geometry cruelly. He taught it well. He forced us to reason and have been the better for those geometry lessons all my life. For the rest, there is a possible explanation to his behavior, which renders it more forgivable years after. My brother met a man who had grown up in the house next door to Oldie's school. That man and his family, and I think the neighbors in general, believed Oldie to be insane. Perhaps they were right. And if he had fairly recently become so, it would explain the thing which puzzles me. At the school as I knew it, most boys learned nothing, and no boy learned much. But Oldie could boast an impressive record of scholarships in the past. His school could not always have been the swindle it was in our time. You may ask how our father came to send us there. Certainly not because he made a careless choice. The surviving correspondence shows that he had considered many other schools before fixing an Oldie's, and I know him well enough to be sure that in such a matter he would never have been guided to his first thoughts, which would probably have been right, nor even by his 21st, which would at least have been explicable. Beyond doubt, he would have prolonged deliberation till his 101st, and they would be infallibly and invincibly wrong. This is what always happens to the deliberations of a simple a man who thinks he is a subtle one, like Earl's septic in religion. He is always too hard for himself. My father baked himself on what he called reading between the lines. The obvious meaning of the fact or document was always suspect. The true and inner meaning, invincible to all eyes except his own, was unconsciously created by the relentless fertility of his imagination. While he thought he was interpreting Oldie's prospectus, he was really composing a school story in his own mind. And all this, I doubt that not, with extreme consciences and even some anguish, it might perhaps have been expected that this story of his would presently be blown away by the real story, which we had to tell after we had gone to Belsen. But this did not happen. I believe it rarely happens. If the parents in which generation always or often knew what really goes on their sons' schools, the history of education would be very different. At any rate, my brother and I certainly did not succeed in impressing the truth on our father's mind. For one thing, and this will become clear in the sequel, he was a man not easily informed. His mind was not active to be an accurate receiver. What he thought he had heard was never exactly what you had said. We did not even try very hard. Like other children, we had no standard of comparison. We supposed the miseries of Belsen to be the common and unavoidable miseries of all schools. Vanity helped to tie our tongues. A boy home from school, especially during the first week when the holidays seemed eternal, likes to cut a dash. He would rather represent his master as a buffoon than an ogre. He would hate to be thought of coward and a crybaby, and he cannot paint a true picture of his concentration camp without admitting himself to have an subsequent slave. We all like showing scars received in battle, the wounds of the ergastulum. Less, my father must not bear the blame for our wasted and miserable years at Oldies, and now, in Dante's words, to treat of the good that I found there. First I learned, if not friendship, at least gregariousness. There had been bullying at the school. When my brother first went there, I had my brother's protection for my first few terms, after which he left school. We may call Whitehorn, but I doubt if it was necessary. During those last declining years of the school, we boarders were too few and too badly treated to do or suffer much in that way. Also, after a certain time, there were no new boys. We had our quarrels, which seemed serious enough at the time, but long before and the end, we had known one another too long and suffered much together not to be at the least very old acquaintance. That I think is why Belson did me in the long run so little harm. Hardly any amount of oppression from above takes the heart of a boy like oppression from his fellows. We had many pleasant hours alone together, we 5 remaining boarders. The abandonment of organized games, though a wretched preparation for the public school life to which most of us were destined, was at the time a great blessing. We were sent out for walks alone on half holidays. We did not do much walking. We bought sweets in drowsy village shops and buttered about on the canal bank, or sat at the brow of a railway cutting, watching a tunnel mouth of trains. Hertfordshire came to look less hostile. Our talk was bound down to a narrow interest which satisfied public school boys. We still have a curiosity of children. I can even remember from those days what must have been a first metaphysical argument I had ever took part in. We debated whether the future was like a line you can't see, or like a line that is not yet drawn. I have forgotten which side I took, though I know what I took it with great zeal. And always there was what Chesterton calls a slow muttering of old jokes. The reader will notice that school was thus coming to reflect a pattern I had already encountered in my home life. At home, the bad times had drawn my brother and me closer together. Here were times were always bad, and the fear and hatred of Oldie had something to do with the effect upon us all. His school was in some ways very like Dr. Grimstone's school, of vice versa, but unlike Dr. Grimstone's, it contained no informer. We stood 4 squares against the common enemy. I suspect that this pattern occurring twice and so early in my life was unduly biased my whole outlook. To this day, the vision of the world which comes most naturally to me is in one in which we two, or we few, and in a sense we happy few, stand together against something stronger and larger. England's position in 1940 was to me no surprise. It was the sort of thing that I always expect. Hence, while friendship has been by far the chief source of my happiness, acquaintance of or general society has always meant little to me. In I can quite understand why a man should wish to know more people than he can make real friends of. Hence, too, a very defective, perhaps culpably defective interest in a large impersonal movements, cause, and the like. The concern aroused in me by a battle, whether a story or reality, is almost in an inverse ratio to the number of the combatants. In another way, too, Oldie's school presently repeated my home experience. Oldie's wife died, and in a term time, he reacted to bereavement by becoming more violent than before, so much so that we made a kind of apology for him to the boys. You will remember that I had already learned to fear and hate emotion. Here was a fresh reason to do so, but I have not yet mentioned the most important thing that befell me at Oldie's. There first, I became an effective believer. As far as I know, the instrument was the church to which we were taken twice every Sunday. This was high Anglo-Catholic. On the conscious level, I reacted strongly against the peculiarities. Was I not an Ulster Protestant? And were not these unfamiliar rituals an essential part of the hated English atmosphere? Unconsciously, I suspect, the candles and incense, the vestments, and the hymns sung on our knees may have had a considerable and opposite effect on me, but I do not think they were the important thing. What really mattered was that I heard the doctrines of Christianity as distant from general uplift, taught by a man who obviously believed them, as I had no skepticism. The effect was to bring to life what I would already have said that I believed. In this experience, there was a great deal of fear. I do not think there was more than was wholesome or even necessary, but if in my books I have spoken too much of hell, and if critics want a historical explanation of the fact that we must seek it not in the supposed puritanism of the Ulster childhood, but the Anglo-Catholicism of the church at Belsen. I feared for my soul, especially on certain blazing moonlight nights in the curtainless dormitory, how the sound of the other boys breathing in their sleep comes back. The effect, so far as I can judge, was entirely good. I began seriously to pray and read my Bible, and to attempt to obey my conscience. Religion was among the subjects which we often discussed, if my memory serves me, in an entirely healthy and profitable way, with great gravity and wisdom hysteria, and without the shamefacedness of older boys. How I went back from this beginning you shall hear later. Intellectually, the time I spent at Oldie's was almost entirely wasted. If the school had not died, and if I had been left there 2 years more, it would probably have sealed my fate at the Scholar for good. Geometry and some pages in West English grammar, but even those I think I found for myself are the only items on the credit side. For the rest, all that rises out of the sea of arithmetic is a jungle of dates, battles, exports, imports, and the like, forgotten as soon as learned, and perfectly useless had they been remembered. There was also a great decline in my imaginative life. For many years, joy, as I have defined it, was not only recent but forgotten. My reading was now mainly rubbish, but as there was no library at the school, we must not make Oldie responsible for that. I read dawdling school stories in the Captain. The pleasure here was, in the proper sense, mere wish fulfillment and fantasy. One enjoyed vigorously the triumphs of the hero. When the boy passes the nursery literature to school stories, he is going down, not up. Peter Rabbit pleases a disinterested imagination, for the child does not want to be a rabbit, though he may like pretending to be a rabbit, as he may later like acting Hamlet. But the story of the unpromising boy who became captain at the first 11 exists precisely to feed his real ambitions. I also developed a great taste for all fiction I could get about an ancient world, cool Vadis, darkness and dawn, the gladiators, Ben-Hur. It might be expected that this arose out of my new concern for my religion, but I think not. Early Christians came into many of these stories, but they were not what I was after. I simply wanted sandals, temples, togas, slaves, emperor galleys, amphitheaters. The attraction, as I now see, was erotic, and erotic in rather a morbid way, and they were mostly a literature rather than books, rather bad books, was what has worn better, and what I took to the same time is the work of Rider Haggard, and also the scientific fiction of H.G. Wells. The idea of other planets exercise upon me when peculiar, heady attraction, which was quite different from any of my literary interest, most emphatically. It was not the romantic spell of Das Fern. Joy, in my technical sense, never darted from Mars or the moon. This was nothing coarser and stronger. The interest, when the fit was upon me, was ravenous like a lust. This particular coarse strength I have come to accept as a mark and be interest, which has it in psychological, not spiritual. Behind such a fierce tang, there lurks, I suspect, a psychoanalytical explanation. I may perhaps add that my own planetary romances have been not so much the gratification of that fierce curiosity of its exorcism, the exorcism worked by reconciling it with the subjecting it to the other, the more elusive and generally imaginative impulse that the ordinary interest of science fiction is an affair for psychoanalysis, and is born out of the fact that all who like it, and like it thus ravenously and equally, by the fact that those who do not are often nauseated by it. The repulsion of the one sort has the same coarse strength and fascinated interest of all of the other, and is equally telltale. So much for oldies, but the year was not all turn. Life at a vile boarding school is in the way of good preparation for the Christian life, that it teaches one to live by hope, even in the sense by faith, for at the beginning of each term, home and holidays are so far that it is hard to realize them as to realize heaven. They have the same pitiful unreality when confronted with distance and end of term, as tomorrow's operation may blot out the hope of paradise. And yet, term after term, the unbelievable happen. Fantastical and astronomical figures like this time 6 weeks shrank into practicable figures like this time next week, and then this time tomorrow, and the almost supernatural bliss of the last day punctually appeared. It was a delight that almost demanded to be stayed with flagons and comforted with apples, a delight that tingled down in spine and troubled the belly, and at moments went near to stopping the breath. Of course, this had a terrible and equally relevant reverse side. In the first week of the holiday, we might acknowledge that term would come again, as a young man in peacetime, in full health, acknowledges that he will one day die. But like him, we could not even, by the grimmest memento mori, be brought to realize it. And there, too, each time the unbelievable happened, the grinning skull finally peered through the disguise. The last hour, held at bay by every device of our will and imagination, knew came in the end, and once more it was the bowler hat, the Eton collar, and the knickerbockers, and clop, 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 the evening drive to the quay. In all seriousness, I think that the life of faith is easier to me because of these memories. To think in sunny and confident times that I shall die and rot, or I think that one day all the universe will slip away and become memory, as Oldie slipped away into memory three times a year, and with him all canes and disgusting food and stinking sanitation and the cold beds. This is easier to us. If we had seen just that sort of thing happening before, we have learned not to take present things at their face value. In attempting to give an account of our home life at the time, I am troubled by doubts about chronology. School affairs can to some extent be dated by surviving records, but the slow continuous unfolding of family life escapes them. Our slight alienation from our father perspectively increased, and part of no one was to blame. In a very great part, we were to blame. A temperamental widower, still prostrated by the loss of his wife, must be a very good and wise man indeed, if he makes no mistake in bringing up two noisy and mischievous schoolboys who reserve their confidence wholly for each other. And my father's good qualities, as well as his weaknesses, incapacitated him for the task. He was far too mainly and generously to strike a child for the gratification of his anger, and he was too impulsive ever to punish a child in cold blood and on principle. He therefore relied wholly on his tongue as the instrument of domestic discipline, and here, as a fatal bent towards dramatization and rhetoric, I speak of it the more freely since I inherited, produced by a pathetic yet comic result, when he opened his mouth to reprove us. He no doubt intended a short, well-chosen appeal to our common sense and conscience, but alas, he had been a public speaker long before he became a father. He had for many years been a public persecutor. Words came to him and intoxicated him as they came. a small boy who had walked on a damp grass in his slippers or left a bathroom in a pickle found himself attacked by something like a Cicero on Catiline or Burke on Warren Hastings. Semile piled on semile. Rhetorical questions on rhetorical questions, and the flash of an orator's eye, and the thundercloud of an orator's brow, the gestures and the cadence and the pauses they pause, might be the chief danger. One of so long that my brother, quite innocently supposing the denunciation to have ended humbly, took up his book and resumed his reading, a gesture which my father, who had after all only made a rhetorical mass calculation of about a second and a half, not unnaturally took for cool, premeditated insolence. The ludicrous disproportion between such harangues and their occasion puts me in mind of advocate in Marshall who thunders about all the villains of the Roman history, while meantime Liz est de tribus capellis. This case, I beg the court to know, concerns a trespass by a goat. My poor father, while he spoke, forgot not only the offense, but the capacities of his audience, and the resource of his immense vocabulary were poured forth. I can still remember such words as abominable, sophisticated, and superfluous. You will not get the full flavor unless you know an angry Irishman's energy in explosive consonants and the rich growl of his R's. A worse treatment could have hardly been applied, but to a certain age this invectives filled me with boundless terror and dismay. From the wilderness of the adjectives and the welter of the unintelligible emerge ideas which I thought I understood only too well, as I heard with implicit and literal belief that our father's ruin was approaching, that we should all soon beg our bread in the streets, that he would shut up the house and keep us at school all year round, that we should be sent to the colonies and there end in misery the career of crime in which we had, it seemed, already embarked. All security seemed to be taken from me. There was no solid ground beneath my feet. It is significant that at the time, if I woke in the night and did not immediately hear my brother's breathing from the neighboring bed, I often suspected that my father and he had secretly risen while I slept and gone off to America, that I was finally abandoned, such as was expected of my father's rhetoric. Up to the certain age, then quite suddenly, it became ridiculous. I can't even remember the moment of the change, and the story well illustrates both the justice of my father's anger and the unhappy way in which he expressed it. One day, my brother decided it would be a good thing to make a tent. Accordingly, we procured a dust sheet from one of the attics. The next step was to find uprights, and the step ladder in the wash house suggested itself. For a boy with a hatchet, it was the work of a moment to reduce this to a number of disconnected poles. 4 of these were then planted in the earth, and the sheet draped over a stroll in the garden, accompanied by us. The sight of four slender wooden posts rising from the grass moved him in a pardonable curiosity. Interrogation followed. On this occasion we told the truth. Then the lightnings flashed and the thunder roared, and all would have gone now, as it had gone in a dozen previous occasions, but for the climax, instead of which I find you have cut up the step ladder. And what for, forsooth, to make a thing like an abortive Punch and Judy show. At the moment, we both hid our faces, not alas to cry, as will be seen from this anecdote. One dominant factor in our life at home was the daily absence of our father from about 9 in the morning till like 6 at night. The rest of the day we had the house to ourselves, except for the cook and the housemaid, with whom we were sometimes at war and sometimes in alliance. Everything invited us to develop a life that had no connections with our father. The most important of all our activities was the endless drama of Animal Land in India, and this of itself isolated us from him. But I must not leave the reader under the impression that all the happy hours of the holidays occurred during our father's absence. His temperament was mercurial. His spirits rose as easily as they fell, and his forgiveness was as thorough-going as his displeasure. He was often the most jovial and companionable of parents. He could play the fool as well as many of us, and had no regard for its own dignity, conned no state. I could not, of course, at that age see the good company by adult standards. His humor being of the sort that requires at least some knowledge of life for its full appreciation. I merely basked in it as the fine weather, and all the time there was the sensuous delight of being at home, the delight of luxury civilization, as we called it. I spoke just now of vice versa. Its popularity was surely due to something more than farce. It is the only truthful school story in existence. The machinery of Garuda stone really serves to bring out in their true colors, which would otherwise seem exaggerated, the sensations which every boy had on the passing from the warmth and softness and dignity of his home life to the provisions, the raw and sordid ugliness of school. I say had not has, for perhaps homes have gone down in the world and schools have gone up since then. It will be asked whether we have no friends, no neighbors, no relatives. We had, to one family's particular, our debt is so great that it had better be left with some other matters to the next chapter. Okay, so we're done with chapter 2. See, it's just more of the story. Obviously, it had nothing to do with the concentration camp, from back in the day. But I guess that's the way that he saw the life in school in oldie school. So far, I like it because it's his life, it's his. So I like it because even in the title, Surprised by Joy, but then it says the shape of my early life. It's like seeing someone's past and then the trajectory of how they become, when they're already an adult and they're you see where they came from. So I like it so far. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. Again, I just read chapter 2 of Surprised by Joy by C.S. Lewis, and I will just, please don't forget to subscribe, give me a thumbs up, share, comment.